Hello. Today the movement we'll be teaching me, our novice athlete, will be the dumbbell split snatch. The dumbbell split snatch is a pretty advanced exercise that is used to develop power, dynamic stability, and deceleration qualities for our athletes. Dumbbell split snatch involves multiple movements and also is dynamic in the means that it also switches stances during the movement. It also involves lower leg stability and also upper extremity stability needed to lock out the dumbbell up top, and also the lower leg stability needed to absorb the energy after the dumbbell has been locked out, as well as maintain the split stance during the movement to stabilize the entire core and the rest of the body. So it develops also core stabilization properties as well. This technique will be taught using the progressive part method, while substantially using freezing degrees of motion. The reason why we'll be freezing degrees of motion is because this will allow the athlete to grasp one aspect and some abilities and qualities of the entire movement, and allow them to master smaller parts of the movement as we progress. That will help them be able to progress properly, and will also help them be able to cleanly do the movement and understand each part of the movement and why each part is important. So the sequence will be pretty simple, and the warm-up, there'll also be a specific warm-up before we even begin to train, to still ingrain some of those movement qualities and some of those movement specific vectors that the athlete will be experiencing, in hopes that they can begin to make connections with these movements that will transfer over into completing the entire movement. It's important that we note that to complete this movement, and the purpose of this movement is to develop power. We all know in the literature that in order to develop power, our athletes must be exhibiting maximum intent to move the weight forcefully and as fast as possible. So in order for our athletes to be able to move this weight as forcibly and fast as possible to develop the power that we are looking for, the athlete needs to feel comfortable doing this movement, and they also need to feel empowered and need to have a lot of reps during this movement. And the technique needs to be near flawless. The technique is also important because the technique will also facilitate greater power production, as well as reduce injury risk during performing this skill, as well as on the field or on the court, so we don't develop any maladaptive movement patterns that can translate into creating other problems later. So we'll begin with our athlete. In the first warm-up, this is the warm-up the athlete will use the entire time, and it will consist of 5 pulls, 5 presses and locks, and 5 drops. So the warm-up is intended to give the athlete a sense of familiarity with the exercises, as well as some of the main parts and positions that their body will be in to create this movement. So we must cue that when the press comes overhead, that they lock it out at the shoulder blade. It'd be very important to create a kinetic stability throughout the shoulder, all the way through the core to the legs, to maintain stability throughout the entire movement, to decelerate the movement. The last portion is, once they have the ability to press and lock, the last portion will involve dropping from this position. So it begin here, a press to drop. into the split stance. Press to drop into the split stance. This would be key because this is a method of degrees of freedom, as we know that the entire movement involves a pull, a press, and a drop into a split. And here we've pulled, we've pressed, and now we've dropped into the split. And so just by showing them those 3 warm-ups, they'll be able to incorporate all 3 of the movements in sequence, further developing neural patterns, muscle sequencing, and proprioception. Proprioception is the ability to sense the joints in space and motion, your motion. So throughout this entire movement, the athlete is required to forcibly lift, press, jump slightly, develop power through triple extension through the hips, knees, and ankle joints, and then to decelerate quickly into an entirely different stance, with a load overhead. So the ability to create proprioception throughout the entire body will vastly increase just through the amount of variability in this exercise. The type of feedback we want to give our athletes is the first, when we're mastering the pull, we want to make sure that the dumbbell is not looping outwards. So we want to coach them from this angle when we're looking at their pull. We want to make sure that they're not looping the dumbbell upward and the dumbbell is traveling in a vertical plane. We also want to make sure that they tuck their tailbone underneath to make sure that they're generating power throughout the entire kinetic chain, and we're not losing any energy that we need to start from a anteriorly tilted pelvis to a posteriorly tilted pelvis during the motion. So they tuck their tailbone and make sure we get a nice vertical pull. Again, a nice vertical pull. Some of the feedback we want to give our athletes is to see if they're able to keep that dumbbell in a vertical plane. So some of the techniques you could do is you could, as the coach, stand directly about 6 inches to be safe, to protect your own self. Is stand directly in front of the athlete, and no athlete wants to hurt their coach, so they'll be sure to make sure they pull it, even if it means that they fall back on their heels. That's still a good way to ensure that they're able to pull in the vertical plane. Another feedback component is during the drop and lockout movement. Some of the feedback you want to give them is that you want to ensure that they aren't locking out in a short, small stance, as this is not inducive or conducive to develop some of that deceleration quality we want with this back leg, and also the stability component of the front leg. The athlete will feel more comfortable being closer, but as they feel more comfortable with the movement, they'll be more comfortable to really lock out and develop some of that stability throughout the entire kinetic chain. So our sequencing will work as previously mentioned. They will develop a high pull. The high pull would then be will then add a lockout. The next sequence motion they will learn will be a traditional dumbbell snatch. The next position they will learn is a static hold, which will introduce the split. So they're here, and they just, I like to coach a fist out to create some stability throughout the core, make sure they're squeezing their core, and they'll just lock. This just gets them comfortable with this split position. We want to make sure that some of the feedback they'll get is that they'll realize their big toe may leave the ground. This means they're losing connection from the hips down through the lower kinetic chain. And they'll want to try to maintain full contact of the entire foot. And that is usually one of the main keys we like to teach, is just keep that big toe down. And when they're able to keep that big toe down, that means we're getting full translation of all the energy throughout the entire kinetic chain. The next movement will go from that static hold to a locked out press and drop. And so now you see we combine all the previous movements to the dumbbell snatch. We've introduced a static position of the split stance, and now we're making it a little bit more dynamic by making the athlete drop into the position. Once the athlete has felt comfortable dropping into position, we add the pull back into it, and then they should be able to begin to practice the complete movement of the dumbbell split snatch. And here is a completed pull and dumbbell split snatch. Another time, here's another nice one. Make sure they stabilize at the top like I did not. And you want to make sure that a lot of force is being generated, and you'll know as a coach, as an athlete, how much force they're generating when you look at the speed of the dumbbell being pulled up. Again, it's going to develop proprioception. It's going to develop power, speed, dynamic stability from the core to the shoulder and the front leg, and dynamic deceleration qualities with the back leg. And all in all, this would be great. It's a great first exercise of the day for your speed and power block to progress into some more movements. This movement is pretty great for athletes, and it's very sport specific. This movement has a lot of transfer into sports. And again, using a method of freezing degrees of freedom as well as part progressing, we're able to teach the dumbbell snatch, the split dumbbell snatch, pretty easily, and hopefully our novice athlete is able to utilize this exercise to improve their ability